They gave whatever they were capable of giving. God doesn't expect you to charge giving on your credit card and go further into debt. God expects you to give out of what you have. We aren't supposed to give a fixed amount. That's not what the Macedonians did. That's not, as we shall see in a few moments, what God asks of us, or a fixed percent. We're not supposed to worry on whether it's set against the gross or the net. Those questions are not germane to the discussion of Christian giving. The issue is you give as you are capable of giving. And they did that. Number 7 in our list, and the second one in verse 3, their giving was not only proportionate, but, and this is a very important corollary to that, their giving was sacrificial. Verse 3, I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave. So they gave what they had, but they gave it in proportions that were sacrificial. Their giving was beyond what could or would be expected of such poor Christians. In fact, their giving would be a contradiction to their condition. And I remind you of verse 2 that they gave out of deep poverty and in a great ordeal of affliction. Times were difficult. Life was difficult. They had very little, were extremely poor. A contradiction in their condition when compared to the generosity and the overflowing abundance of their liberality. With no regard for themselves, with no regard for their future needs, compelled by concern and care and love and compassion and obedience and all of those things, they were glad to place themselves in an impoverished position even further, dependent on God, and believe that God would supply all their needs. As Philippians 4:19 told us, my God shall supply all your needs according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. They believed that. They believed they needed to take no thought for what they should eat or drink or wear because God would meet that need. They believed that what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6 is exactly what he meant, that if he clothes the grass of the field and the lilies of the field and feeds the birds of the air, he is going to take care of his own. And it was in that attitude that they gave like the widow in Mark 12. They gave generously and they gave sacrificially. Like David, who said, I will not give the Lord that which cost me nothing. They were not about to give God something that didn't represent sacrifice. They were glad to place themselves in deeper dependence on God to supply their needs by demonstrating generosity to the poor saints at Jerusalem whom they had never even met, but for whom they had a heart of compassion. So we find in verse 3 that their giving was proportionate. But not just proportionate, that is to say, not just out of what they had, but sacrificial. And then thirdly, which would be the 8th point, the third one in this verse, the 8th one overall, their giving was voluntary. It says at the end of verse 3, they gave of their own accord. They gave literally of their own volition. They gave of their own will. They gave out of their own initiative. They were self-motivated and spontaneous. This was their choice. In fact, the term here is very interesting. Altheiratoi in the Greek, which is the word used, they gave of their own accord, literally means one who chooses his own course of action. They chose to do this. They weren't coerced. They weren't manipulated. They weren't intimidated into this. They weren't bribed into it. They weren't sort of coddled into it. They weren't brought into it by some promise of something or some trickery or some gimmick. There was no manipulation. There was no coercion. It was out of their own hearts. And let me just dig into that a little more deeply. It is possible that Paul had not even asked them to give. It is possible that due to their deep poverty, Paul never even brought that up among them. If you look at chapter 9 and verse 2, Paul says, I know your readiness in this matter of giving to the Corinthians, of which I boast about you to the Macedonians, namely that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. Interesting, isn't it? What was the original motivation for the Macedonians? Apparently, from what he's saying here, it was the zeal of the Corinthians down in the province of Achaia. It was the zeal of the Corinthians that stirred up the Macedonians originally. Now remember what we have here. As Paul is writing 2 Corinthians, We told you that it is a year that has passed since he first told the Corinthians about giving. He mentions that. A year ago, he had told the Corinthians about giving, and they had started to give. We saw that right there in chapter 8. They had already begun to give as much as a year before. Apparently, it was their initial interest in responding to Paul and giving that the Macedonians heard about. When Paul told the Macedonians about the generosity of the Corinthians, it stirred up the Macedonians to want to give. So we could suggest then that the Macedonians were following the example of the Corinthians who started a year before, and that the Corinthian generosity initially motivated the Macedonians, and then they just ran with it, and maybe Paul never really overtly asked them to give, knowing how poor they were. They volunteered it. Based upon the pattern of the Corinthians, they wanted to get involved. That certainly does fit the statement of verse 4, where Paul says they were begging us with much entreaty for the favor of participation in the support of the saints. That too might indicate that Paul was reluctant to ask them for anything because they had so little, but they were begging to be able to participate. They volunteered. It was right out of their hearts. They were freely, voluntarily, willingly giving from the heart. So what we find then in verse 3 is that giving is proportionate, giving is sacrificial, and giving is voluntary. Very, very important issues. And the understanding of those 3 out of the 8 elements of their giving leads me to a bit of a digression this morning that is absolutely crucial if we're to understand this whole matter of giving. Because whenever you talk about giving in a Christian context, there are always people who are going to say, well, I thought we were supposed to give 10%, right? I mean, that's the sort of traditional Christian percentage. We talk about tithing. The word tithe is a word that means a tenth. The Greek equivalent of tithe is dekate, which means a tenth part. It's a mathematical word. The Hebrew equivalent is ma'aser. It means a tenth. It too is a mathematical word. And Christians through the years have just felt, well, we're supposed to give 10%. The Jews gave 10%. Abraham gave 10%. Jacob gave 10%. So we're supposed to give 10%. That's God's abiding standard. And that doesn't fit into here. There's no 10% in chapters 8 and 9. There's no 10% with regard to the Macedonians. They gave what they could give. They gave sacrificially what they could give, and they gave voluntarily. That is, they